Good morning. This is August the 27th. This is Ron, and welcome to Story Time. And again, welcome to Story Time. I've been reading from the 48 Laws of Power, one law every episode. And today's episode, we're reading Law 41, Avoid Stepping into a Great Man's Shoes. What happens first always appears better and more original than what comes after. If you succeed a great man or have a famous parent, you will have to accomplish double their achievements to outshine them. Do not get lost in their shadow or stuck in a past not of your own making. Establish your own name and identity by changing course. Slay the overbearing father, disparage his legacy, and gain power by shining in your own way. In many ancient kingdoms, for example Bengal and Sumatra, after the king had ruled for several years, his subjects would execute him. This was done partly as a ritual of renewal, but also to prevent him from growing too powerful, for the king would generally try to establish a permanent order at the expense of other families and of his own sons. Instead of protecting the tribe and leading it in times of war, he would attempt to dominate it, and so he would be beaten to death or executed in an elaborate ritual. Now that he has no longer around for his honors to go to his head, he could be worshipped as a god. Meanwhile, the field had been cleared for a new and youthful order to establish itself. The ambivalent, hostile attitudes toward the king or father figure also finds expression in legends of heroes who do not know their father. Moses, the archetypal man of power, was found abandoned among the bulrushes and never knew his parents. Without a father to compete with him or limit him, he could attain the heights of power. Hercules had no earthly father. He was the son of the god Zeus. Later in his life, Alexander the Great spread the story that the god Jupiter, Ammon, had sired him, not Philip of Macedon. Legends and rituals like these eliminate the human father because he symbolizes the destructive power of the past. The past prevents the young hero from creating his own world. He must do as his father did, even after that father is dead or powerless. The hero must bow and scrape before his predecessor and yield to tradition and precedent. What had success in the past must be carried over to the present, even though circumstances have greatly changed. The past also weighs the hero down with an inheritance that he is terrified of losing, making him timid and cautious. Power depends on the ability to fill a void, to occupy a field that has been cleared of the dead weight of the past. Only after the father figure has been properly done away with will you have the necessary space to create and establish a new order. There are several strategies you can adopt to accomplish this, variations on the execution of the king that disguise the violence of the impulse by channeling it in a socially acceptable form. Perhaps the simplest way to escape the shadow of the past is simply to belittle it, playing on the timeless antagonism between the generations, stirring up the young against the old. For this you need a convenient older figure to pillory. Mao Zedong, confronting a culture that fiercely resisted change, played on the suppressed resentment against the overbearing pressure of the venerable Confucius in Chinese culture. John F. Kennedy knew the dangers of getting lost in the past. He radically distinguished his presidency from that of his predecessor, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and also from the preceding decade, the 1950s, which Eisenhower personified. Kennedy, for instance, would not play the dull and fatherly game of golf, a symbol of retirement and privilege, and Eisenhower's passion. Instead, he played football on the White House lawn. In every aspect, his administration represented vigor and youth, as opposed to the stodgy Eisenhower. Kennedy had discovered an old truth. The young are easily set against the old, since they yearn to make their own place in the world and resent the shadow of their fathers. The distance you establish from your predecessor often demands some symbolism, a way of advertising itself publicly. Louis XIV, for example, created such symbolism when he rejected the traditional palace of the French kings and built his own palace of Versailles. King Philip II of Spain did the same when he created his center of power, the palace of El Escorial, in which he was in the middle of nowhere. But Louis carried the game farther. He would not be a king like his father or early ancestors. He would not wear a crown or carry a scepter or sit on a throne. He would establish a new kind of imposing authority with symbols and rituals of its own. Louis made his ancestors' rituals into laughable relics of the past. Follow his example. Never let yourself be seen as following your predecessor's path. If you do, you will never surpass him. You must physically demonstrate your difference by establishing a style and symbolism that sets you apart. The Roman Emperor Augustus, successor to Julius Caesar, understood this thoroughly. Caesar had been a great general, a theatrical figure whose spectacles kept the Romans entertained, an international emissary seduced by the charms of Cleopatra, a larger-than-life figure. So Augustus, despite his own theatrical tendencies, competed with Caesar not by trying to outdo him, by differentiating himself from him. He based his power on a return to Roman simplicity, an austerity of both style and substance. Against the memory of Caesar's sweeping presence, Augustus posed a quiet and manly dignity. The problem with the overbearing predecessor is that he fills the vistas before you with symbols of the past. You have no room to create your own name. To deal with the situation, you need to hunt out the vacuums, those areas in culture that have been left vacant and in which you can become the first and principal figure to shine. When Pericles of Athens was about to launch a career as a statesman, he looked for the one thing that was missing in Athenian politics. Most of the great politicians of his time had allied themselves with the aristocracy. Indeed, Pericles himself had aristocratic tendencies, yet he decided to throw in his hat with the city's democratic elements. The choice had nothing to do with his personal beliefs, but it launched him on a brilliant career. Out of necessity, he became a man of the people. Instead of competing in an arena filled with great leaders both past and present, he would make a name for himself where no shadows would obscure his presence. When the painter Diego van Velázquez began his career, he knew he could not compete in refinement and technique with the great Renaissance painters who had come before him. Instead, he chose to work in a style that by the standards of the time seemed coarse and rough, in a way that had never been seen before. And in this style, he excelled. There were members of the Spanish court who wanted to demonstrate their own break with the past. The newness of Velázquez's style thrilled them. Most people are afraid to break so boldly with tradition, but they secretly admire those who can break up the old forms and reinvigorate the culture. This is why there is so much power to be gained from entering vacuums and voids. There's a kind of stubborn stupidity that recurs throughout history, and is a strong impediment to power. This superstitious belief that if the person before you succeeded by doing A, B, and C, you can create their success by doing the same thing. This cookie-cutter approach will seduce the uncreative, for it is easy and appeals to their timidity and their laziness. But circumstances never repeat themselves exactly. When General Douglas MacArthur assumed command of American forces in the Philippines during World War II, an assistant handed him a book containing the various precedents established by the commanders before him, the methods that had been successful for them. MacArthur asked the assistant how many copies there were of this book. 6, the assistant answered. Well, the general replied, you get all those 6 copies together and burn them, every one of them. I'll not be bound by procedures. Anytime a problem comes up, I'll make the decision at once, immediately. Adopt this ruthless strategy toward the past. Burn all the books and train yourself to react to circumstances as they happen. You may believe that you've separated yourself from the predecessor or father figure, but as you grow older, you must be eternally vigilant lest you become the father you had rebelled against. As a young man, Mao disliked his father and in the struggle against him found his own identity and a new set of values. But as he aged, his father's ways crept back in. Mao's father had valued manual work over intellect. Mao had scoffed at this as a young man. But as he grew older, he unconsciously returned to his father's views and echoed such outdated ideas by forcing a whole generation of Chinese intellectuals into manual labor, a nightmarish mistake that would cost his regime dearly. Remember, you are your own father. Do not let yourself spend years creating yourself only to let your guard down and allow the ghost of the past, father habit history, to sneak back in. Finally, as noted in the story of Louis XV, plenitude and prosperity tend to make us lazy and inactive. When our power is secure, we have no need to act. This is a serious danger, especially for those who achieve access and power at an early age. The playwright Tennessee Williams, for instance, found himself skyrocketed from obscurity to fame by the success of The Glass Menagerie. The sort of life which I had previous to this popular success, he wrote later, was one that required endurance, a life of clawing and scratching, But it was a good life because it was a sort of life, a vital energy for which the human organism is created. I was not aware of how much vital energy had gone into the struggle until the struggle was removed. This was security at last. I sat down and looked about me and was suddenly very depressed. Williams had a nervous breakdown, which may in fact have been necessary for him. Pushed to the psychological edge, he could start writing with the old vitality again, and he produced A Streetcar Named Desire. Fyodor Dostoevsky, similarly, whenever he wrote a successful novel, would feel the financial security he had gained made the act of creation unnecessary. He would take his entire savings to the casino and would not leave until he had gambled away his last penny. Once reduced to poverty, he could write again. It is not necessary to go to such extremes, but you must be prepared to return to square one psychologically rather than growing fat and lazy with prosperity. Pablo Picasso could deal with success, but only by constantly changing the style of his painting, but often breaking completely with what had made him successful before. How often our early triumphs turn us into a kind of caricature of ourselves. Powerful people recognize these traps, like Alexander the Great. They struggle constantly to recreate themselves. The father must not be allowed to return. He must be slain at every step of the way. Reversal. The shadow of a great predecessor could be used to advantage if it is chosen as a trick, a tactic that can be discarded once it has brought you power. Napoleon III used the name and legend of his illustrious granduncle Napoleon Bonaparte to help him become the first president and then emperor of France. Once on the throne, however, he did not stay tied to the past. He quickly showed how different his reign would be and was careful to keep the public from expecting him to attain the heights that Bonaparte had attained. The past often has elements worth appropriating, qualities that would be foolish to reject out of a need to distinguish yourself. Even Alexander the Great recognized and was influenced by his father's skill in organizing an army. Making a display of doing things differently from your predecessor can make you seem childish and, in fact, out of control, unless your actions have a logic of their own. Joseph II, son of the Austrian Empress Maria Theresa, made a show of doing the exact opposite of his mother, dressing like an ordinary citizen, staying in inns instead of palaces, appearing as the people's emperor. Maria Theresa, on the other hand, had been regal and aristocratic. The problem was that she had also been beloved, an empress who ruled wisely after years of learning the hard way. If you have the kind of intelligence and instinct that will point you in the right direction, playing the rebel will not be dangerous. But if you are mediocre, as Joseph II was in comparison to his mother, you are better off learning from your predecessor's knowledge and experience, which are based on something real. Finally, it is often wise to keep an eye on the young, your future rivals in power. Just as you try to rid yourself of your father, they will soon play the same trick on you, denigrating everything you have accomplished. Just as you rise by rebelling against the past, keep an eye on those rising from below and never give them the chance to do the same to you. The great Baroque artist and architect Pietro Bernini was a master at snuffing out younger potential rivals and keeping them in his shadow. One day, a young stonemason named Francesco Borromini showed Bernini his architectural sketches. Recognizing his talent immediately, Bernini instantly hired Borromini as his assistant, which delighted the young man, but was actually only a tactic to keep him close at hand so that he could play psychological games on him and create in him a kind of inferiority complex. And indeed, despite Borromini's brilliance, Bernini had the greater fame. His strategy with Borromini was a lifelong practice. Fearing that the great sculptor Alessandro Algardi, for example, would eclipse him in fame, he arranged it so that Algardi could only find work as his assistant. And any assistant who rebelled against Bernini and tried to strike out on his own would soon find his career ruined. And that's the end of Law 41, and about striking out on your own and not following your father, or the avoid stepping into a great man's shoes is the title. And coming up on Tuesday, which should be the 30th, it's Strike the Shepherd and the Sheep Will Scatter. Law 42. Trouble can often be traced to a single, strong individual, the stirrer, the arrogant underling, the poisoner of goodwill. If you allow such people room to operate, others will succumb to their influence. Do not wait for the troubles they cause to multiply. Do not try to negotiate with them. They are irredeemable. Neutralize their influence by isolating or banishing them. Strike at the source of the trouble, and the sheep will scatter. And that's going to be on Tuesday, August 30th. And until then, thank you for joining me, and have a great weekend.